Amazing. So if we can just get started by introducing the people who are, well, presenting or speaking at the moment. So I'm Kiana from Bond. I'm the communities advisor, and I look after the working groups, including the small NGOs group that is led by Gemma Chambers, who's also on this call. So if Gemma can just say a few words, and then we will officially get started with the presentation. And Bill, who is the presenter, can also introduce himself. Gemma, you have the floor. Gemma, I just unmuted you. There you go.
So I'm guessing if you can hear me, Kiana, then everyone else can.
Yes, I hope so. If people can.
Perfect. Yeah. If not, if everyone can let us know. Yeah, my name's Gemma. I'm the head of fundraising at Tools for Self-Reliance and also the chair of the small NGO group, along with Peter Marlowe and Richard Thunder, who are on the steering committee. This is the second event this year for the small NGO group, and we're trying to cover a range of topics and formats and to meet the needs expressed by the members of the group. We're still quite in the early stages of moving forward after a bit of a break, so it's really, really good to have so many people on the webinar today. If anyone's interested in being involved in the group going forward or has any suggestions about activities, then please do get in touch. I guess through you, Kiana, in the first instance.
Yes, through me, and I'll share my email address in the chat box at the end.
Perfect. That would be great. It'd be really good to have a wide range of organisations represented, and it's really good to have so many people here today. I guess, shall I hand over to Bill?
Yes, and before I hand over to Bill, just to say to the participants that if you have questions at any point, or if you can't hear us, please write in the chat box. We are monitoring the chat box as well, so we will hopefully resolve any issues if there are any. Hopefully there won't be.
I'm sure everything will go smoothly. There'll be no technological glitches whatsoever.
Great. Well, on that great note, Bill, do you want to?
Okay. Hi everybody. I'm Bill Bruty. I'm going to be facilitating this webinar for the next hour or so. Just a little bit on me. I've been in the fundraising world now for about 35 years and actually started in the international development sector 21 years ago. So I don't know whether that's worth celebrating or commiserating. I do a lot of work all over the world with NGOs and also with local civil society, principally in Africa, working both with fund seekers but also with grant makers themselves. In fact, we've just come back from doing a workshop in Nairobi 2 weeks ago for the Siegel Family Foundation, who are an American grant maker. So hopefully we're going to take you through the rudiments of trust fundraising within an international development context. One thing I would say, if during this presentation you have any questions, you'd like anything clarified, then please do put it up in the chat box and we can see if we can pick it up during the course of the presentation. I'm going to engage Gemma with this presentation every so often because it's going to be interesting to get her perspective on some of the ideas we're putting across. And essentially we're going to be giving a presentation for about half an hour, and then the remainder of the session is there for an open discussion forum for us to discuss some of the issues and put it within the context of your work. So yeah, let's get underway. Here we are. This is our topic. We run a course on this subject, which is running in January 2020. And essentially what we're going to be doing over the next 40 minutes, maybe less, is condensing a 2-day course into this short webinar. So hopefully this whets your appetite for that course, and because we're just dealing with some of the key topics from that. Yeah, here's a bit more about me. As I said, it's 35 years ago. And you can see kind of the range there, particularly the international development agencies. We've worked with both NGOs in this country, like Farm Africa, but then a lot of agencies outside of the UK, and indeed funders like Portuguese, I think African Women's Development Fund, and the Siegel Family Foundation. Okay, over the next few minutes, what we hope to do is we're going to talk particularly about the landscape of foundation funders for development. And this has come from some recent research looking at the particular context in which we're operating in. We're then going to look at the area of how do you actually take something to the market that is going to be attractive to the market. So we're going to introduce an idea about how you package and present your projects. Then we're going to be looking into the basic research techniques for these foundations. And then finally, no, not finally, we're going to do a winning application. So we're going to look at what goes into that, and then a universal concept note. And I think there's one more slide if we get there. And then the final thing we want to look at is the aspect of donor engagement and record keeping. So that should keep us nicely occupied for the next few moments. Right, first of all, we're going to look at the landscape of UK foundation funding. We're relying here on two sources. One is a report which is actually quite dated now, 2012, on global grant making, which is published by Nuffield Foundation. But then something a little bit more up to date, which is the £1 Million Donor Report, which talks about £1 million gifts by benefactors in the UK and what's going on with them. I'm going to look at about 10 years of the data from those reports. Where this is significant, it's about 1/3 of the £1 million gifts go into grant-making trusts, either to create them or to fatten them up. So seeing what happens with major individuals' philanthropy is actually quite important in terms of how it connects with foundations. So first of all, let's look at the first piece of the landscape. This comes from the Nuffield report. And I think it's worth bearing in mind that when we look at the DFID contribution to NGOs, it's again from 2009-10, it's 362 million. But then we look at foundations, and actually we're talking about 292 million. So UK foundations are in some ways as important to us as NGOs based in the UK as DFID. The other figure there of 599 million is DFID's funding for NGOs globally. So some of that will go to NGOs that are not based in the UK, people like AMREF and other large local NGOs, or even NGOs based outside the UK. So spending on international development, this is another important point, is that 13% of charitable spending on foundations came from, so international development represents 13%. So in this survey here from Nuffield, the foundations that are in the study are not just purely funding international development. These foundations are 13% of their money goes to international development. If we take the whole of the UK grant-making foundations, it's just 9%. So it's a relatively small proportion, but a small proportion of a very big cake. Drilling down into this, it's interesting that Africa is by far the largest recipient, 37% of funding. And actually, even within Africa, East Africa. So the entire funding that goes into East Africa is more than the funding for the whole of the rest of Africa. And then Asia's coming in at 23% of the funding. As we can see here, this is a table which identifies the main areas of their funding. And it comes out as direct healthcare and formal education are the largest, the areas where the largest amount of money goes into. And then sustainable economic agricultural development and investment, and then we're going down the list into WASH programs. So if you're in the field of education and healthcare, then foundations are a very good source of money. The one thing I kind of want to point out in here is a lot of the money that we're seeing coming through foundations is what we would describe as retail philanthropy. And by being retail philanthropy, they're funding direct projects, pieces of work that are addressing a particular need in a particular area, be it the creation of a clinic, the establishment of a school. And this is a type of funding that trusts particularly like, and obviously lends itself very well to areas such as health and education, where you can build and equip clinics and you can build and equip schools. Retail philanthropy is very different from the sort of things that DFID or the larger foundations get into, which is wholesale philanthropy. And by wholesale philanthropy, they mean real systemic change. So that's equipping advocates across Africa. It's changing a skill set within a country or within a profession, or it's about dealing with attitudes. But bring back to this, it's kind of interesting that what we're picking up here is a kind of propensity for retail philanthropy within UK foundations, funding specific projects with a specific service. So we can go on to the next one. Yeah, the big money flows out of the big funders. So let's have a quick look at this. Those of which are 50 million or larger, these are like the very biggest grant makers, are providing 49% of the funding for international development. Now that is a very small number, providing a very large chunk. So if you're going to engage with this market and expect to get large money, there is a temptation to concentrate on the top 50. Now, interestingly, we did a piece of research a few years ago where we trawled through these top 50, actually came out of this report, and we're trying to identify who they actually funded. And having said here that they've got the vast majority of the money, 49% of it, what we found is bigger foundations don't actually fund NGOs, or not at a very substantial level. These larger foundations tended to support research institutes, global multilaterals, and health institutes. So, for example, Comic Relief, if you really pour into Comic Relief's grant making, you'll find that their largest grant goes to the Global Fund, a global multilateral, not a UK-based INGO. So in some ways, having said the money is up with these people, there's also a second question saying, well, actually, the big money within the big people doesn't go to INGOs. We then looked at the smaller funders. So in the top 50 funders, between 35 and 50 on that list. And again, what you've got an interesting picture there is that a lot of these funders are funding pet projects that they're connected with. This is either due to their travels, their family travels, their life experiences, and in a way they know what they're going to fund, and they're to a degree locked into it. Classic case in this one is the Samworth Foundation, which has a link through one of the family schools with projects in Tanzania and in Kenya. So again, the smaller ones tend to have their pet projects. Where we found the opportunities, we're actually in the middle ground. So it's the middle ground funders are the sort of people that will pick up INGOs. They're not locked into one particular thing, but they're not large enough to fund multilaterals or research institutions. So that, in a way, that's our hunting ground. Now, this is interesting. If we're saying, and there's different research on that 11% of the general public give to international development, and then we got another figure that's saying 9% of foundations give to the general public. So as we're getting into institutionalized philanthropy and larger gifts, there's a slight decline in the proportion of those funders who give to international development. What about wealthy individuals? So here we've got an overview for the last 10 years of the £1 million donors in this country. And the larger blue line, the darker blue line at the top represents the total number of £1 million gifts. And you can see there's a kind of steady increase, maybe a bit of plateauing happened over the last few years. But then the lighter blue line bumbling along the bottom is the number of gifts, the value of the gifts that are actually going to international development. And what we're seeing here is that as £1 million gifts might be growing, gifts to international development are not growing. In fact, if anything, they're heading in a different direction. And those little peaks in that bumbling blue line at the bottom, 2010, 2013, 14, are very much connected with humanitarian emergencies around that time. Now, this is important because this is the source of current money going into trusts. All the other money we're dealing around in trusts and foundations is historical money that's come from invested endowments, new money coming from living benefactors comes largely from these sources. And what we're not picking up here is a picture of growth in this area. So we can look at the next slide here. Just quickly going back, 11% from public, 9% from foundations. You take the millionaire givers, the average is 5.6%. This graph here is actually the number of £1 million gifts rather than the value. And again, what we're seeing here is a very similar picture of the correlation of money going into development is not the same as the overall philanthropy in this country. So are we slipping off the radar? And I must admit, this is fairly new research that we did in preparation for this webinar, and I'm still running through the implications of this as to why, as we get to higher value givers, there's less for development than in the general public. I don't know if I can bring Gemma in at this point.
Hello.
So I'm curious. I'm wondering why is it that large and, as you say, more institutionalized givers seem to be less keen on development than the wider population of philanthropy? I don't know whether you picked up.
I thought it's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting that you make the distinction between development and humanitarian disaster response, which has got that very emotive, high profile. Some funders have got a specific response mechanism for crisis, like Google have got a crisis fund where they can make very substantial gifts. It's good for high profile giving, but I guess development generally, there's that disconnect from the cause. You can't visit it or touch it or see it. It's a complex, not easily solvable problem, and apart from, like you mentioned earlier, building hospitals or schools, it's difficult to buy one big thing, and capital appeals often focus on those very large gifts as a contribution towards a big substantial thing, which isn't part of the picture for long-term systemic change. So I think that could probably be a factor.
So it's a kind of complex propositions we're putting. Some of them are quite high value. They're not touchable. They're not immediately there for the donor.
You can't put a plaque on them.
You know, obviously those ones like Samworth, where they have that link, they know the schools, they know the location they're talking about, they probably travel there.
Yes.
They've got that tangibility, but for the rest, it can feel a bit remote.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you do in tools for self-reliance? How do you try and bridge that gap between the distance between the donor and the beneficiaries?
It's a difficult one because I've worked in UK-based charities before where it was all very much about inviting donors in, showing them around. They could meet people that had participated in projects, and obviously that's not an option for us. We do try and gather as much information as we can from evaluation visits and from partners in project delivery. We try and kind of facilitate like online discussions with our partners to connect them with donors and things like that. And we do have the element of, because we send tools for vocational training projects, we do have a workshop that we can invite people to, and that's our kind of way of having a physical presence. But it's very difficult. And we do rely a lot on communications and storytelling to make that connection in the absence of being able to physically put our donors there.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned storytelling, which we're going to come on to a bit later. And, you know, I've done a lot of my work with UK charities as well. I remember working for an environmental organisation where we had conservation projects all over the UK, and I could turn up to any donor and almost find them something, a wood to look at or a nature reserve, within a matter of a few miles of their own home. And then when I shifted into international development, I couldn't do that. I couldn't take donors to Haiti, Liberia. In fact, the even greater problem is I hadn't been there myself either. So I couldn't even take them in my own communications. You know, I was reading something and then rewriting it for something. I think that can be problematical.
Yeah, we do try and use members of staff that have been on visits to communicate with funders, because then they can share their personal experience and they are very good storytellers because they've experienced that themselves rather than like myself at remote.
Okay, thanks, Gemma. Let's move on. What we're going to look at now is what do you take to the market? So what can you, how can you improve your chances of being attracted to a donor? And what we're going to introduce here is a theory which I'm very arrogantly naming under my own name, partly because I want to be kept for posterity, and I want to be like Ansoff and have a matrix that generations afterwards will refer to. So I'm going to introduce to you a matrix, a theory in which you can look at your different projects in a different way. What I'm going to suggest is that everything you do is made up of two ingredients. One, your methodology, the way you do it, and the second thing is your purpose, so your beneficiaries and why you do it. So that's the first two parts of the matrix. The next thing I'm going to say is actually within these activities you can either be doing something new, so it's a new way of working or a new set of beneficiaries, or they can be the same, so you're working with the same people or you're working with new people. So now we've got four variables. We've got method, purpose, and we've got new and the same within these variables. So let's have a look how this builds into a matrix. There we are, my name in lights. Right, we've got our axes. Now let's do the horizontal axis. I can never remember whether it's X or Y. X is horizontal. So X axis is method. Y axis, purpose. Now we're going to put in our little measurements. So same and new at the outer end. Now let's get in our little grid. So the first type of project we've got is same purpose, same method. So this will be typically the bread and butter of what you do. You've done it for a long period of time. You know it works. You're working with beneficiaries that you're familiar with. And this is your bread and butter. So same purpose, same method. Now let's twist it a bit, and we get into the second quadrant where we're saying same purpose. No, we're saying new purpose, but same method. So this is where you're taking a piece of work and you're adapting it to a new issue. So it could be a different location of beneficiaries, or it could be a slightly different beneficiary or audience. But principally, you're doing roughly the same sort of thing that you've always done. Let's have a look at the next one. Same purpose, same method. So again, this is a new method, same purpose, new method. So this is an audience you're very familiar with, a location you're familiar with, but you're adapting the way that you do things so that you're evolving, innovating. And now the final quadrant, new purpose, new method. So here, you're in the area of pure innovation. You're working with people you've never worked with before, and you're using a methodology you've not used before or you're unfamiliar with. Now, I can contend that nearly everything that we do fits within one of these four quadrants. So we'll take an example, and this comes from one of our clients, and we're talking about counselling and testing for key populations at risk of HIV. And for those of you that don't work in the HIV sector, I'll just quickly say what I mean by key populations. Key populations are those groups of society at most risk and most difficult to reach out to, where the prevalence of HIV is higher than the normal population. And a huge amount of HIV work is now concentrated on what are called key populations. So for this agency, that's their bread and butter, is providing counselling and testing to key populations. So let's see how it evolves. There's quite an interesting link between GBV and HIV outcomes. And also there's quite an interesting similarity in terms of the process in which you engage people through voluntary counselling and testing, which you can then adapt for victims of GBV. So in this particular agency, they've moved and they've evolved and they now have programs in this area. Pretty much the same method, but adapted for a different purpose. So let's swing it to the next category. Again, we're dealing with people, key populations, people at risk of getting HIV, but we've moved away from counselling and testing, and now we're working in terms of building advocacy training for key populations to campaign for better health services. So we can see same beneficiary group, but different methodology. The final one, advocacy training for Indigenous people to defend their land rights. Why? We've probably never done advocacy training before, and Indigenous people are kind of new territory for you. It's not a massive step, but it's quite significantly different. Now let's have a quick look in all of these, because funders prefer different quadrants. So if we take the bottom left-hand quadrant, same purpose, same method, funders don't often like this because how do they get out? Where's the exit strategy? Not invented here. That's ongoing. Neither do they like new purpose, new method, because that looks like you're chasing opportunities and it's too risky. Funders tend to like new purpose, same method, same purpose, new method. So where we use this with a lot of clients is it's as an assessment tool. You spread your projects along here and it can tell you how sellable your portfolio is. And furthermore, gives you an idea about how you can emphasize the saleability of a project. So we always say to people, keep with consistency, so stress the consistency with your method and emphasize the innovation with purpose. So keep one consistent and then emphasize the change in the other. Don't confuse the donor by talking about too much change or too much consistency. Can we throw in the very last bit now? This is interesting. Because this again is a project mix from one of my clients. They now have got a thriving social enterprise product, which is workplace health counselling and signposting. So building up from their experience of working with people at risk of HIV and key populations in particular, sensitive workplace health counselling is not a massive step forward. It evolves from their methodology, but it's completely different purpose. And in fact, that's an enterprise, not part of the NGO activity. Just a quick pause. Have we got any sort of questions coming in or any comments at this stage worth responding to?
There's a lot of good conversation between the participants, which is really good. We continue that in the chat box. But yeah, if anyone has a question, please feel free to post it into the chat box and I can read it out to Bill at our next break, or you can raise your hand and we can also come to you now.
Okay, yeah, fine. I'm more than happy with this to kind of stop and clarify. Is there anything in particular? So is there anything in particular at this point?
We have a question here from Martin, who has a question on innovation and funders. He asked, I thought funders liked innovation.
No, not always. Actually, it's a really interesting point because I've just come back from this workshop in Nairobi working with the Siegel Family Foundation. Now, Siegel are really interesting if you're in the arena of education funding, particularly in East Africa, because they are an incubator. They pick you up and they love innovation, they love new ground, they love change makers. And Siegel see their role as very much about taking the risky, the innovative, and then when it's run its course, they then actively hand it over to the likes of Rockefeller and Ford and Hewlett and Gates, who will take it on beyond its risky phase. A lot of these projects are too small and too risky for Gates to go anywhere near, so they use Siegel as a filtration system for their innovation. So Siegel love innovation, Gates prefer consolidation. So they do mix together and have different nuances. Also, I think innovation is same method, new purpose. That's innovation. New method, new purpose is probably a little bit beyond innovation. That's probably a bit too risky. So yes, they do like innovation, but I think it's innovation maybe in a more modest way than you think it is.
Great.
Any others?
Anyone want to raise your hand and ask a question or post in the chat box? Let us know now.
Are there any comments that we can go through from before? Great. Just to add that there will also be more time for questions at the end. If you can't think of anything now and you think of something later on, you're more than welcome to ask it then. Okay, so we have one. First of all, someone saying that the matrix is really useful, so thank you. Someone is asking from Womankind, please could you clarify the quadrants that the funders do or don't like?
Okay, just to clarify that again, going back to our quadrants, new purpose, same method, because it's saying you know what you're doing, you have a skill set here, a track record, and you're adapting to different social issues. We work quite a lot with population services in Kenya, and their methodology is almost exclusively social franchising. But their social franchising products stretch from everything from education to health to general livelihood. So they're very much keeping the same methodology, but changing the purpose. Equally, they like same purpose, i.e. you know your community, you know your beneficiaries, but you're evolving in your methodologies. Same purpose, same method, they will fund, but they have to be kind of sure that there's an exit for them. They can't fund you forever. And also you've got to kind of make it feel that there's something about their ownership and their contribution to it more than money, because that feels like not invented here. New purpose, new method, while some funders do like that territory, like my friend Siegel, others are frightened by that. It's just too risky and sometimes a bit difficult to justify. So it's the top left and bottom right that are your best territories for getting external funding.
Any other questions before we move on? Great. So we can move on to the next section.
Okie doke. Right, what we're going to run through now are some of the, basically how do you find out about these guys? And what we're going to look at here is how to use two fairly effective research sources. First of all is Funds Online, which is provided by the Directorate of Social Change, and then the Charity Commission database, which has the accounts and basic details for every registered charity, including every registered foundation. And we're going to be using a particular case study of an international development funder to show what we can find out and how we can find it out. So we can go to the next slide now. Okay, next bit. We're going to use Alan and Nesta Ferguson. Now, many of you probably have got some money from Alan and Nesta Ferguson. They are a mid-range usual suspect for international development. And this is the page from Funds Online on Alan and Nesta Ferguson. The first thing I'm very conscious is you need a good pair of glasses to read this. It's quite a dense piece of information. And what they're trying to do is take a fairly large funder and condense all of the key information into one page. Very useful because it saves you having to go out and find these funders, because you can use their filter to pick up funders for international development, and then you can click on the profiles. So I do recommend Funds Online as a good starting point for people, but not the end point. So let's go to the next bit. Obviously, it makes enormous sense to, having identified the funder, to actually go to their website. And here's a page from the Alan Nesta Ferguson website. Again, one of my favorite pages about us, the history of the foundation. There's something about foundations where history is a really phenomenal part of them. Largely, many of them are living off historical money. It comes from their family. So the family stories are interesting. So that's often a place which I'll sit on my website, is actually looking at the family story. So this is a brief bit about Alan and Nesta Ferguson. Elnora, daughter, has set this foundation up, named it in memory of. So Elnora is interesting. We're going to come back to Elnora a bit later so we can find out a little bit more about her. So next thing, that I would do is I'd go straight to the charity commission, go to the accounts tab on Find a Charity, in the Find a Charity section when you've got the charity number up, and then go and bury myself in their grants list. So what we've got here is all of the grants to overseas education by Alan and Nesta Ferguson in the last reported year, December 2017. I think this is a slightly different picture from what we picked up from Funds Online. Some of the donations that they cited, like Practical Action, are not necessarily the largest donations. And there's something else I think that's come out from this, which tells you a little bit more about the nature of the funder, about their approach to grant making, that doesn't come out from a single year profile. So can we put a little bit out to the audience here to see what people are picking up from this piece? I'm sure many people already use this, but it's kind of fascinating. I mean, I find there's some quite interesting revelations just from this one page.
Great. So if you can all write it in the chat box, and we will read it out.
So just having looked at this, what do you immediately pick up from Alan and Nesta that's interesting and will affect your approach to them?
So someone is saying size grant shows around 20K. Andrew is saying most grants end with 000. Oh wow, there's a lot of comments and they're moving very quickly.
Can we pick out 3 or 4 and we can move?
Sure. There's a focus on education and children. Not much multi-year funding. Don't fund same organization for more than 1 year in a row. Yeah. Children in Africa. And yeah, they don't fund the same organization for more than a year, like we mentioned.
Yeah, let's pick up on that. I think this is really interesting. You can only get this if you look at a number of grant years. They chuck everybody off the bus at the end of the year, and then it's all full of empty seats for you to get on. So this is kind of interesting funder, because it will tell you that if you're on the bus, they're going to kick you off. If you're not on the bus, there's some empty seats. So it's a relatively easy funder to get into as well. Now, if you really spend your time looking at that, you want to maybe look at 4 or 5 years of grants, because what you might find is that these are a carousel. So 2016 grantees reappear in 2013. So then you begin to see maybe there isn't such an opportunity to get in. They kind of got their rolling list of grants to pick up. So this kind of information, I think, gives you a really interesting idea of the aperture of how you can get into the funder. Also, not many people seem to be increasing the amount. So, you know, what you've got is what you get. As to whether you get more, I'm not so sure there's much evidence from this.
We've got a few more comments if you want us to read it. So someone is saying it's not a sustainable source of funding. Another participant is saying 2 major grants per year could equal potential to grow. And someone else has said they do matched funding, very hard for really small organizations.
Yeah, yeah, really small. I think it is a bit of a tough one to get into. Question to bear in mind, yeah, some of these figures here, that's the amount that they've accounted for in that year, but they are actually 3-year commitments. So you can get more than 1 year's funding from them. Definitely with these guys, if you think they're going to fund you forevermore and be, you know, bankrupt, no way. So it's going to be in and out with these guys. I want to move on, because otherwise we're going to spend too much time buried in research. Let's move on with a little bit of the story. Final thing about Alan and Nesta Ferguson. It's my final twist on the research. Having found Elnora as the woman who helped set the trust up, I'm kind of keen to find out a bit about her. So here we go. This is my active keyword searching, and it's an article about Elnora from a business paper. Gives you a little bit more of a feel for her as a person. So let's have a little bit of time to just read and absorb this, and then I'll make a few comments on this. Anything coming in from people? Oh, my lovely friend Elnora.
Not at the moment, but
Okay.
if people have any comments, again, please do share it in the chat box.
I'll just put one of the things I find useful about this type of thing is essentially you're writing to a group of people, not to an organism, an institution. You're actually writing to something that's got a humanity to it. If we were applying for money from this trust when Elnora was alive, it would very much be an expression of her personal philanthropy.
Sure.
Obviously, she's not been with us for nearly over 10 years now, but she will be remembered by those trustees.
We've got a few comments in, some things people have picked up. We've
Yeah.
got that she was interested in education, she was faith-based in attitude, education in Africa were her passions, and yeah, again, passion for Africa.
Which again, from the website in its first, you get maybe that in a technical way, but here you get it in the living, breathing humanity of it.
And someone else is saying gender equality emphasis, that she was a pioneer for it.
Also, I think it's one interesting thing about the faith background and Quaker values. Now, I've worked with a number of faith-based funders, particularly one funder in the very Catholic funder, and I always remember one of the main players in that funder saying to me, you don't have to be Catholic to apply, but you have to understand our value set. So if you can secularize Catholic values, we're on the same page. So you don't have to be a Quaker to apply or to be in line, but you do have to kind of align yourself to Quaker values. So here we are, folks. We've done a tour of Ellen and Nesta Ferguson. I hope I've given you a quick run through 3 or 4 of the key research tools, funds online, that grant list from the Charity Commission, their website, but also get behind the personality, get those articles on the founder. Let's change gear. We're now going to talk about proposals. And now, what we're going to share now are what I would call the 15 elements of a winning proposal. What this is based upon is a study of about 100 funding application forms. Having studied loads of them with all their different questions, all their different formats, what we've come up with is a template that every single form is rooted in 15 questions. So one of them could be 38 questions. There'll be subvariants of these core 15. So what I'm going to take you through now are the 15 questions that you will find on every funding proposal. Question number 1, I want to know how many people will benefit. So you've got to feed the donor a number of beneficiaries. Question number 2 is I need to know what is the specific need. Is it about inclusion of people with disabilities? Is it about educational achievement? Is it about health? Number 3, I want to know what you do. What's your aim? So I want to know about the house of the project. So what's the aim of your organization? Number 4, I actually want to know how you engage your beneficiaries. So are beneficiaries involved in the governance of the organization? Do you consult them in the development of projects? What is your relationship with your beneficiaries? Number 5 is don't tell me you're the only actor on the stage. Everything you do is in collaboration, whether it's with government, whether it's with local partners. So how do you connect with the work of other organizations? Number 6 is more specific. Number 5 might be about policy overlap. Number 6 is about who exactly are you working with, because nearly all of our work is done in partnership. Number 7 is the one question that changes with every different funder. And that is, how are you relevant to our funding criteria and our policies? Actually, it's quite an important question. It's the first one that the funders read. So if you don't answer that one, they won't read the rest of the application. Number 8 is what does the project hope to achieve, its aims and outcomes. Number 9, what are the key activities? How are you going to deliver it? Number 10, what's the timescale and when does it, and in particular, when does it start? And number 11 is how much do you need? So 8 to 11 are core project development questions. Number 12, how will you monitor your progress? Number 13, and then how will you evaluate that project? And number 14, a question we love so much, is if this is going on for a long period of time and we're only going to fund it for 3 years and then disappear like Elnora Ferguson, how will you fund it in the long run? But if it's a short-term project, it's capital, or it's a funding horizon and the project horizon are the same, then another question will kick in, which is how will you disseminate the results if it's a one-off activity? Can we quickly go back?
Sorry.
This is quite important because if you can generate this information, naturally, you've got the raw material for every application form. If you're faced with a funder who doesn't have an application form, imagine they're asking you these questions. So a lot of my clients have concept notes which are answering these questions for their projects long before there's a funder identified with them. So if you can develop projects that answer these questions, have those concept notes ready, it will speed up your translation from project plan into successful application. We do a little pause on this point because and Gemma, I don't know if I can bring Gemma in.
Yeah, I mean, these are the kind of key elements that really aim to cover all bases in terms of what does a funder need to know in order to decide if they want to support you, and more importantly, why do they want to support you and not one of the other 30 applications that they're looking at that particular day. And we use a proposal template with about 5 or 6 headings, which between them cover probably most of these questions. Now that I look at it, I think a challenging one for a small organisation applying for small funds, because we're, just to kind of refer back to a question earlier on about size and source of funding, our income is about 750,000 a year. We don't receive any differed funding, and trust funding is about 200,000 of that, so it's quite an important chunk. Of that 200,000, our average grant size is less than 4,000.
My goodness.
So we have a lot of small funders that support our work. And that kind of, I mean, partly reflects the fact that our projects are relatively small. They're kind of 10 to 20,000, but it does mean that we have a lot of funders that support us and need communicating with. And a lot of them are small themselves. And unlike bigger funders, don't necessarily share their criteria and policies, but from little bits that we've been able to pick up, we know we've kind of decided why we're going to apply to them. So I always try and include that, even if we're not able to make specific reference to their criteria and policies, because they don't publish them in the way that a larger funder does, to try and still communicate why you've chosen to make this application, as opposed to, well, I've just kind of chucked it out to you because you fund something vaguely similar.
Yeah, so I mean, actually, folks can imagine a lot of those funders are not really asking for this level of detail.
No,
and making a contribution.
They're not, but they've still got money to give away, and they're still getting applications in their hundreds. So anything that kind of, when you have less to work with, anything that you can do to give yourself that edge.
Yeah, and I think one of the things with this is that this is basically good project design.
Yeah.
And if you've got a project that can't answer these questions, there's probably a design flaw somewhere along the line. So that's, I mean, and again, these kind of questions are more relevant to the larger funders, but as we've seen from the previous research, the big money is in the smaller number of larger funders. So it's going to be hard to make a large amount of money out of trust for development funding if you're piling up a lot of small bodies making contributions. And I have to say, I'm impressed with an average grant size of 4,000, 200. That's impressive. Sorry, carry on, Gemma.
I'd say it can be difficult in terms of particularly reporting, because we have a kind of communication framework where we report back to trusts. I was going to say whether they want us to or not, which sounds a bit pushy, but even if there's not a formal reporting structure, which there generally isn't for very small trusts, we still know that they appreciate our regular reports and updates. And with small funders, we've had communication to say, because they're making small grants, they often don't hear anything from the organisations that they've supported.
Yeah, and sometimes they change. Sometimes they I mean, one of the things we've done when we looked at small funders is it's remarkable how many they are small, but they have one substantial grant to make a year.
Yes, I mean, this year, I talked about our annual income being about 750,000. This year it will be higher because we had a funder that only made grants of, say, 2,000 to 3,000 and had done so for several years. We treated them the same as we treated other small funders, in the sense that we sent them updates and reports and what have you. And they weren't asking for anything else. And this year they approached us and said they wanted to make a one-off large gift, and could we put in a proposal? And they made a grant of £250,000.
Wow, so that's almost 100.
So yeah, and we didn't know, even though I kind of always say you should look at accounts and see what the giving capacity is of a funder, as well as the grants that they make, because there can be a massive difference between the money that they're sitting on and the money that they distribute. They weren't on the radar as a funder with a large capacity.
I mean, have you since found out why they've changed?
I think they're winding down. Which is a shame, but I think it would have only ever been a one-off from this particular funder, and they've chosen to invest in us, which is fantastic. But to us, it kind of justifies the time and resource that we spend on looking after our relationships with all funders, irrespective of the size.
I think it's a real credit to your stewardship that they could have given that money to anybody, but clearly, even though they've been a low value funder, they like you.
Yeah. And we like them.
Okay, let's move on, because we're doing the final bit now, because we've talked about proposed research, we've talked about proposals. Now let's talk about loving funders. And what we're going to do now is I'm going to share with you 14 elements of a well-managed relationship. Now, we do a hell of a lot of reviews of people's high-value fundraising operations, people like Cancer Research UK, Practical Action, Concern, and we dive into how on earth they've got their high-value funding. In the process of that, we've accumulated about 1,000 case studies of high-value funding. And what I'm going to share with you now are the 14 elements of a well-managed relationship. And this comes from the study of all these different case studies. Like the application one beforehand, that comes from a study of 100 application forms. I didn't create that checklist. I had to look at what evidence was presented before me. And this is about evidence, the 14 things that you can do to look after a funder and love each other. So let's look at number one. Go beyond the obvious research services. We've seen a little bit of that with Alan and Nesta Ferguson, but don't just do basic research. Find out and get under the skin of your funder. Number two, find out whether they've got a connection with your cause. Have they been to the locations that you are? And as much as you can do within GDPR, to a degree, we are talking about organizations rather than individuals. You do need to know that connection. And many funders will offer it. Number three, please be tidy. The amount of organizations that I go to whose record keeping is such a mess that no one can have the faintest clue about a relationship and how to improve it. So please get your research information in a tidy, easy to access and use format. Number four, I'm going to go on to the engagement options now. So number four is, have you given them a chance to have a sniff of you? Come to a general event where they can hide and look at you without being pounced on by a fundraiser. Number five, have they been to see you? Either your projects or your headquarters. Have you been to see them? So number five is a home match. Number six is an away match. Number seven is neutral venue. So have you met the funder at a neutral location? That could be at a conference, could be at a consultation event, but basically it's that third option. It's not your home, it's not away, it's an intermediary location. This is interesting. Have you followed up after rejection? That seemed to be quite a successful path for people. And in some ways, I could almost say you stand a better chance of getting money from someone who's turned you down from someone who's never heard from you. So the good management of rejection is quite an important asset. Number 9 is, have you incorporated their suggestions into our proposal? Now, with Gemma's average of 4,000, these people are not really going to get engaged in the proposals, but the bigger numbers, they want to feel it's co-developed. So you've got to create that opportunity for the donor to engage, change and amend and feel that their paw print is all over the proposal. Number 10, have you met the reporting requirements? The amount of times that people have got relationships, fouled it up in terms of reporting, often due to staff turnover, and then they're in the naughty corner and probably can never reapply for several years. Number 11 is an interesting one, free food. Now, free food is a technique which is basically saying you know them well enough to provide them something of value without them asking for it. So sharing that evaluation report, clipping out articles about news that might be worth them. But your relationship is good enough that you know what they would value and you give it to them without them asking for it. Number 12 is, do you know them as people as well as an organization? The people that you're actually talking to might be the administrator, people who gave the money and set the foundation up. So it's at the people side as well as the institutional side. Has the top person in your organization communicated to this donor and said, hey, I know who you are? Even if it's a small amount of money, it's an email, it's an easy communication, just to give them a sense that someone at the top knows who they are. And then number 14, which I'm kind of passionate about, particularly for higher value, is don't have one-to-one relationships. Try and see if you can engage people at 2 different levels. So if there's a board relationship to trustee and then an administrator to fundraiser, so that you're fanning these relationships out and making them more broad and more solid as a result. So here's your checklist. I mean, we do a lot of this with SCORE relationships, and I can say categorically that the more of these tools that you are and have used, the greater value you have in your relationships. So having spoken with Gemma a minute about loving donors, these are the 14 elements of loving a donor. Can I bring you in finally, Gemma, for this bit? It's not the mechanical skeleton or love or...
We're actually holding our first funder event next year because we've had a lot of funders that have funded us for a long time, albeit at small levels. But as we mentioned, with the kind of capacity to give more, we're inviting them to participate when we are planning our next strategy. And the feedback that we've had from the funders that we've approached about this has been really positive. So
that's a kind of number 5, that's them coming to you and contributing. Yeah, I think so. We don't have in our organisation a lot of involvement from trustees in trust fundraising, but I've worked in organisations where that has been the case, and where for some donors you've kind of circulated information about funders and trustees have made contact and things like that. So it has been very effective. I think on the trustee level, it's often talked about that if you can get board members and trustees engaged in fundraising, if you connect with the trustees of these trusts, that's the key. I mean, if I lived with only clients that had good trustee and board connections, and those are my clients, I'd have no one. I think the reality is that actually a lot of relationships are about at a professional level between the administrator and you as a fundraiser. Yeah, much more. And the trustee thing, I think, is a little bit overhyped.
Yeah, I guess for some boards where there's a lot of connections and trustees that are in a position to use them, then it's great. But that's not the reality for most places that I've worked.
Yeah, and that's not the reality I see. So yeah, I think you can thrive without having them. Obviously, it's good to have them, but it's not the panacea. Kind of going to the sort of formal part of it. So I guess we're the remaining part. How much time we got left?
We have just under half an hour.
Oh, fantastic! Actually, that's timing's
Perfect.
going.
Yeah.
How did I do that? So here's much more of the open part of it, so people can field questions, clarification, challenges. I'm always interested to see whether some of these ideas come across as a bit raving mad.
So yeah, again, if you can just send your questions in the chat box, that would be great.
So Amy, have we got anything at this particular point we can address?
Not at this moment, no. Yeah, just send anything at all.
Gemma, anything to add in at this point?
I'm just looking at my notes.
So we do have one. And a participant is saying, how do you go about applying to a foundation or trust when there is no public-facing application information?
So we're talking about a trust who has actually said no unsolicited applications, or they have no contact. So no phone number, no email address, just silence.
For instance, the Siegel Foundation.
Gosh, my friends. Right, interestingly, Siegel are a kind of good case in point. If you're seeking funds for them in Malawi and Rwanda, they have an open funding calls. If you're looking to get funding, I think in Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, you can only get into them if you're invited in by a current grant holder, or they find you. And having done enough time work with funders and spent a lot of time asking funders how do they get their grant holders, the biggest pathway is peer referral. So they pick you up through contacts with other funders, or they ask their existing grant holders. So if you're looking at that funder and actually they are giving a substantial amount of money, but you don't know the way in, you need to map your relationships with the people who already are in there, because they may well be your vehicle to get in. And I think this is an increasing trend now, that whether it's more anonymous, there's more unsolicited funders, or even those that claim to be open, in reality are using the back door as a way of choosing that, particularly their more substantial grant holders.
So there is a bit of additional information saying there's no information on partnerships on their website, and Fiona has added that this is quite common among small trusts.
Yeah, I mean, incredibly common, because and actually one of the other things is a lot of trusts don't want to tell you much because they quite like the privacy of this world. The lack of transparency in some cases can be quite constructive, because it gives people freedom to do and fund things that would probably be quite challenging for more public funders. So I think there's an element to respecting the anonymity in this environment. But I say, whether they're a small trust with no contact details, or whether they're a large trust with a referral mechanism, I do think working through your peers and working in partnership with others is critical.
Great. We've got another question saying, with regard to chasing up on rejections, is the best approach to thank them for their reply and ask for feedback, or respond to reasons for rejection if a reason has been given?
Gosh, worst thing is if people reject you, they hardly ever tell you whether they've even looked at the application. In fact, most of them don't even tell you they've rejected you. So what you're dealing with is a yawning silence. There's a bit of me that actually quite likes someone who's complaining or going, this was wrong, because if they care enough to say this was wrong, it's kind of indicating there's a little bit of care in there. people they don't care about, they just don't even tell you you're wrong. So if you've got a funder that is in any way saying, oh, I'm angry with this, this is wrong, take that as an opportunity to start a dialogue. I've even met some people who are very good at provoking funders to have a dialogue in order to address the issues that they've caused. I would say the vast majority of people will not respond to your request for feedback. However, I would say in this silent world, always go back, because you may have laid a foundation of understanding for the second application that you didn't have with the first. So quite often decisions are no, not now, but maybe in the future. And if you don't go back again, you miss that opportunity. But it's all done with silence. And I think as a rule of thumb for most of us is never just take one rejection. You always go back.
Sometimes 7 times.
My goodness, I admire your patience.
It happened. It paid off.
We have one more question here, which is, how do you identify and mitigate risks when approaching donors for funding? For example, a lot of foundations have links to fossil fuels.
My gosh, Gemma, do you want to try that one while I gather my thoughts?
We had a discussion about this recently because we were putting together a policy about acceptance and refusal of donations, and an ethical fundraising policy, and about who we would and wouldn't accept donations from. And it was quite a difficult process, because once you start, there's the obvious link. So there's the obvious corporate foundations that some organizations wouldn't choose to take money from. And then once you start researching foundations and trusts and where their money comes from and where they generate income from in investments, that opens up a whole other area of scrutiny, where if you kind of followed it to the logical conclusion, you might feel that you shouldn't take money from them. But then you've got the kind of responsibility to the charity to generate income. We went through quite a long process. We haven't come to a conclusion, in that we haven't got a clear definition of how we are going to make those decisions, other than to share it with trustees when it's large and substantial grants, and proportionate to the amount of income that we could potentially get. We don't apply for a lot of large funds, but then that's not really necessarily an answer either, because any amount of money, if it's derived from sources that might have an ethical issue, it's still money. So the conversation's been had, but a conclusion hasn't been arrived at for us.
It's complicated, isn't it?
It is complicated, because when you follow a chain of money,
yeah, it's complicated. I mean, there's a lot of foundations that are clearly connected with a living, breathing company, and they're getting their dividends from corporate profits.
Yeah.
And so therefore the relationship with the foundation and the relationship with the company is very similar. And I think in those circumstances, you've got to be very aware of what the company does as well as what the foundation does. Obviously the Sackler Foundation has been a case in point for that one recently. But then you've got others where they're very much fed by the wealth of an individual. And you know, they put the money in, and maybe so I think you do need to be aware of where that individual's making their money from, and as well as any reputational risk in there or any ethical risk in there. And then you get others, and I'll take Dolverton, for example, where the original money comes from tobacco.
Mm.
But they disinvested from tobacco. The company, Will's Whiff, doesn't exist anymore. So when you look at their portfolio, there's not a lot connected with tobacco in there, but the original money came from tobacco. So many foundations having long historical roots with the origins of their money, I think if you get too ethical down the historical money generation chain, and you're getting into the murky reaches of the early 19th century and 18th century, then it can be very complicated. Any more questions coming up?
Yeah, and we have a question from Fiona, which is, do you know anything about Scott Bader? They've had an application submitted, but have been in silence for 4 months.
Not specifically, Gemma.
No, I'm not sure, but I'm going to guess it's the small grants program and not the big competitive fund that Fiona's referring to. Yes.
She's saying yes.
Because obviously that one, there's a kind of process and there's published dates. The small one, we did receive funding from them before and it did take a long time. I think we chased up in the end.
I think one of the things to be aware of is that they can be going through quite significant strategic and psychological shifts throughout their life. So if we took Alan and Nesta Ferguson, when that was created, it was very much John and Elnora's fund in memory of her parents, or his parents, I can't get that right. You know, now the founders are not there anymore. We've got a board of trustees who may or may not be related to the Ferguson family. And maybe, you know, they might change overnight. You know, they might decide to jettison everything that's come from the past because they want to make the trust new and fresh and relevant, in which case, the moment they go through that, then everything is going to get stalled. Everything's going to get stalled. So it might be just you've not been successful, but they, you know, they could be going through quite a radical shift and we're not aware of that. Any other questions?
No, not at the moment. So we've got a little bit more time. So if any of you have questions, please send it our way.
Nothing.
No questions so far?
Yeah, Fiona just comments that it seems to be getting harder to, Fiona, do you want to clarify a bit more on that?
And we've got a question coming from Womankind, so we'll wait for your question. But in the meantime, Fiona, you can elaborate on your point.
Okay, so this question about getting harder, is it a bit more specific? Gemma, you any views on getting harder?
We're a bit of a funny one because we have recently expanded the scope of our projects, which has opened up other opportunities for us in terms of funders that we can apply for. So in one sense, we have more opportunities because of the projects that we're doing. At the same time, a lot of funders that have funded us for a long time have closed or have stopped funding us, and the competition's obviously increasing. So it's always difficult.
I mean, I'll try and answer that. Is it getting harder? I mean, the first thing I'll say, I've been at this game, I think I did my first trust proposal in 1987. And I think every single year from 1987 to 2019, I've had people saying it's getting harder. So I think there is easy to say, you know, to get caught into that narrative. But is it getting harder? I think one thing that is making it harder is, I believe that the creation of new charitable trusts is not matching the number of trusts that are spending out. A huge amount of the trusts in the UK derived their wealth from an economy of nearly 50 to 100 years ago. Many of them have gone through major generational shifts, and many of them are, I think, an increasing number are spending out. So we're losing a few, and Gemma, you've given that example of someone that we've lost who's gone from 2,200. And the question is, are we getting more? And I think the question is, maybe we aren't. I don't think the creation of new trusts is anything like the numbers that we're losing in terms of value. And then furthermore, for that graph to do with the major gifts, £1 million gifts, is that I think those trusts that are being created are probably giving, fewer of them are giving to international development. So I think it's particularly harder for our sector. Another piece of evidence I can draw on is that we've studied the accounts of 100 charitable trusts since 2004 to 2018. So we've got quite an interesting data set, and the 100 trusts is a cross-section of the market. It's deliberately put together to be indicative of a typical portfolio of funders that we might have. And over that period from 2004 to 2018, the amount of money these guys are giving out has increased by nearly 75%. But it hasn't been a steady line of increase. It's been a bit of a zigzag getting there. But then there's another interesting statistic within that group, is that about 90% of those funders give pretty much the same amount of money that they gave in the previous year. So if the income's gone up, but 90% of them are still giving roughly the same, who's giving more? And what seems to have happened in each year is no more than 5 funders out of the 100 are responsible for the change in overall grant making. So if you've got a portfolio of 100 funders, my guess is that 5 of them are going to transform. The other 95 are going to be pretty much the same. So if you happen to be in a universe where no one's transformed, or you miss the boat with the 5 that have transformed, yeah, it's going to be harder. It's going to be harder. Does that make sense, doing that verbally? I'm not too...
Yeah, that's really helpful. We've got well, people have had time to write in a few more questions now. Let me see. So someone from Womankind has asked, do you have any thoughts on taking a different approach to trusts housed at law firms or accountancy firms versus family managed trusts?
I'm still a believer that every trust is contactable, that you can find a person to talk to. So I'm still a believer that human relationships are the key to it. It's not about banging out hundreds of proposals. And I'm also, the other thing that I've learned over the time is that the people that you need to be aware of you aren't necessarily the people in the trust. So we take, for example, one of the Sainsbury trusts, who, for what I'm about to say, will remain anonymous. You can look at the director, you can look at the trustees, you can look at the founder, but the person who really decides and advises them on the philanthropy is an advisor who doesn't have a formal role within the funder. And I think increasingly now funders are using networks of advisors and experts to find recipients rather than through the open door. So I think kind of throws it back onto the importance of networking, really. And being at events where advisors or people who whisper in their ear are likely to hear about you. So probably more important about these kind of weird networks than necessarily the formal channels.
Okay. Any more questions?
Yes, let's have a quick look. Thank you to Andrea, who shared that really good policy for everyone to have a look at, and whether or not to accept funds. That's a really useful resource for everyone else on the call.
Everyone is now copying and pasting that
sensibly.
sensibly.
Yes, thank you, Andrea.
We had one more question at the bottom. So yeah, there's one question from Womankind again. It says, are the funds from New Wealth being managed by wealth philanthropy advisors rather than setting up new trusts?
I wish I could say categorically I know the answer to that. The one thing I suspect, though, is I think a lot of new philanthropists are less dynastic in their nature. So if we take the Arthur Weston family, the management of the company is very dynastic. It's intergenerationally Westerns. So therefore, the kind of corporate destiny, where the money comes from, and the foundation destiny are very intergenerational. And so, whereas I'm not so sure that modern entrepreneurs and the modern wealthy are so dynastic in the way that they see their companies going. So I'm not so sure that their philanthropy is as dynastic. So what we're seeing is increasing numbers of funders put money in and then wish to spend it out within their lifetime. And the typical recent example of this was the Tubney Trust, which came from the Blackwell family, that they wanted that money spent within a certain period of time. So I think the very nature of how people are making the money and where they see it going, that are creating the trust, means to say that it's probably more to be spent now than spent in the future. So I think that is a fair point, that it is changing.
There's a really interesting comment here from Nicola, who is saying that they find it really difficult to get their foot in the door of foundations when they have limited capacity of their small team. The idea of trying to get more small donations makes sense, but it would be difficult for us to generate and sustain. Although they're trying to move away from different funding, it's getting harder when you're not able to show tangible outputs. For example, they work in capacity building of researchers. So trying to know it's difficult to try and know the most efficient approach. And I'm sure that's an issue that lots of other small NGOs are having on this call. Another question from Sam is, what do you think the rise of DAFs will have on trust funding?
I think DAFs are increasing. It's obviously a trend that's been quite strong in America, and I think it's increasing in the European and the UK context. That's interesting because you've got more of a professional infrastructure, and they again need to know the marketplace in order to advise the funders behind the scheme. So in a way, they have a need to find out what we're doing. The problem in that is, and again, working with funders, is they have mechanisms about finding out what's going on in our sectors that don't require us feeding them information. I think a few years ago, we were very valuable sources of information for donor advisors. Now, I think they'll do everything they can to avoid asking us for information, because the moment we get that question, we smell money, and that starts to put attention into it. So I think that it is an interesting trend, but I think we've got to be careful about how we feed the value into it, which is the information. Just on the other question about how do you get in with funders, I'm always interested in value, and what I picked up from every study I've seen is it's not an 80-20 rule with trusts, it's a 90-10. So you're likely to get 90% of your money from 10% of your funders. So I'm interested in how do people get that 10% that generates the money? Now, previously, I referred that we've done this research into about 1,000 high value relationships. I've interrogated 500 of them. And the interrogation has been, who started the dance? So did this money come from an approach that was made by the charity to the funder, or was it made from the funder to the charity? So the example that Gemma's just given earlier of this low-level trust giving 200,000, Gemma, you might correct me, but that wasn't an intentional move from you guys.
No. I'd like to say it was.
Yeah, kind of keep it on the target, for goodness sake. Now, when we did this study about who starts a dance, what we found was there are actually only 5 dances. And what you've described to me, Gemma, there is dance number 2. And dance number 2 is where a low-level funder changes and then offers you a large amount of money. Dance number 3, we referred to earlier with Siegel, which is peer introduction. So a funder of yours or a partner organization of yours introduces you to a new funder or persuades an existing funder to give number 4, to give more money. Dance number 5 is you approach them, either responding to an open funding call or stalking them. I'm doing them in a weird order because I kind of want to get to the tension at the end. So 2 is small becomes big, 3 is peer introduction, 5 is you make the approach. Dance number 1 is a product of your brand and your website. They approach you out of the blue. Then dance number 4 is an interesting one. Dance number 4 is where, through experience of your work, the donor approaches you. So, for example, one of our larger clients managed to secure 500,000 from the Rockefeller Foundation. The reason why is that the grant manager in the Rockefeller Foundation had worked in a partner organization with our client in Kenya. They got the job in the US. Rockefeller changes its policy. That person says, oh, I know a decent recipient, and the call is made. So dance number 4 is if you're part of the territory, if you're involving people, if you're walking the sector, the funders will find you. I think we're done, aren't we?
Right, I think we are done, yeah. So thank you everyone for joining us, and I hope you all join me in thanking Bill for giving us a great webinar. I'm sure it'll be very useful to all of your organisations. A quick thing before everyone signs off, just to wrap up, we've got an evaluation form that I'll just post on the chat box now. Oh, that's not to everyone, hang on a second. I'll just post that to everyone now. There we go. And I will also post a link to the sign up form, and it's really important that everyone signs up, so I'll be able to send you all of the links that was in Bill's presentation and the PowerPoint and the recording. I will post that again in just a second once I finish speaking. And if there's a problem of you signing up on the event page, don't worry about that. I'll also post my email, and you can drop me an email with saying that you'd like to receive the resources in today's presentation.
And just to add, again, echoing on what Amy was saying, thank you so much for joining. Thank you to Gemma for organizing this, and again to Bill for joining us. We will be having events again in the future, and that's why your feedback on this webinar would be much appreciated, because it will allow us to do even bigger and better events for you. We had a lot more people on the call than originally signed on. So if you could please, like Amy said, register or send an email to the email address that she just posted. That would be great, so we can ensure that we contact you with all the right follow-ups and presentations and attachments, etc. Thank you so much again, and we hope to see you at the next event or webinar. And if you have any questions, please contact us.
Thank you very much.
Oh,
Thank you.
could I just jump in with one quick thing?
Sure.
Of course.
Before we go, I just wanted to share a reminder about the Safeguarding Conference, which Bond are organising on the 2nd of December, because there is a session specifically for small NGOs, which I think it sounds like a really great session. It's a really good format. It's a kind of world cafe. There's really good topics which are relevant for small NGOs. And it's going to be chaired by our CEO. So please do go and give her a hard time. She'll enjoy that. And register if you haven't done so already. And please do, like Kiana said, give feedback on future events for the group, because we'd really like to plan a programme for next year which kind of meets the needs of the members of the group. So that would be great.
Amazing. And we can share a link to the conference, to information about the conference, but you can also find it on Bond's website under events.
Thanks everyone, and we'll leave the call live for a couple more minutes so you still have access to the links in the chat box. But from us, I think that's all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you everyone.
Thank you so much.